welcome everyone. Tonight's talk is by Dr. Kevin Timpe, and he's right there. But I'll give a brief introduction. This is the Muskegon Community College lecture series, and I don't know what we are in, maybe 22nd, 23rd year of the lecture series, so it's good to keep it going on a long-term trend here, and I appreciate the Academic Affairs Department for funding this every year. And I don't think anyone's here, but if you know them, share the thanks. We will be having another talk in November, if you look at the sign on the way out, on November 14th, and it's on using computer programs to discover when issues in biology might arise, such as drug-resistant bacteria and things like that. So it should be an interesting talk by Dr. Emily Dolson from Michigan State University. So hope you can make that one too. And then in January, we'll have another Pechakucha. For those of you who went to that, was a kind of a popular event. It's 20 slides, 20 seconds, and we'll have a new slate of speakers that we'll try out that format. So look for that in January. Some people ask me, how do you come up with these speakers every year? And I said, I don't know. Sometimes people give me ideas. And so I don't think I've told you this, but how did I get to know about Dr. Kevin Timpe? Well, I was volunteering in a golf tournament, and I was holding a sign. I was a standard bearer that had the scores for the players. And so one of the caddies was a guy I know. He's a student at Calvin. And I said, hey, you go to Calvin, right? And I said, you know, they got a really good philosophy department there. And he goes, yeah, I've taken some philosophy classes. He says, you know Timpe? And I said, not really. So I looked him up, and that's how I got to know him. So your golf team's very good, too.
Okay.
So anyways, that's how sometimes things fall in your lap like that. You hear about people. And so it's good to have him here. And I was looking around online to find out a little bit about him. And I'll share a few things just so you know him before he talks. First thing is, he said he loves coffee, his kids, and his wife in that order.
It's bad that two of my children are here.
Oh, yeah. But at least you beat the wife, so your mom. No, but anyways, he does have coffee here with him, so I'm looking forward to a good talk. And with all that coffee, he's done a lot of things. He is the chair of the philosophy department. He is the Jelima chair in Christian philosophy, all this at Calvin University in Grand Rapids. He received his PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University, and his primary research interests range from metaphysics of free will, philosophy of disability, which we'll hear about today, virtue theory, and philosophical theology. He's a pretty avid researcher. He's published 11 books, including Disability and Inclusive Community, The Rutledge Companion to Free Will, Virtue and Their Vices, the Free Will in Philosophical Theology, and he's published over 60 journal articles and book chapters. He's lectured widely on disability issues more recently, including presenting at the Civil Rights and Civic Virtue Project in Montgomery, Alabama. Tonight he'll be speaking for, 45 minutes to an hour, and then he'll be welcoming questions afterwards, so come on in. So feel free to raise your hand in the Q&A time, take notes, come up with a question. I'm sure he'd love to hear it. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Timpe.
Thank you for that. Thank you for having me. Let me just start with a disclaimer. Even though I am primarily trained as a philosopher, there's a way in which tonight's talk is philosophy and history and public policy. And I've discovered over the years that I'm really bad at boundaries. And so one of the nice things about being a philosopher is you're like, oh, I'm interested in that. And you can always make it philosophy of whatever that thing is. And I'm also bad at keeping my research and my teaching separate. Some folks try to do that, and for me, it's why do one thing when you can do two things? And so I've had journal articles that have come out of handouts that I've started in class, and sometimes I want to write on something, and so then I teach a class to give me the background to do it. My wife and I also do disability advocacy, and so that figures in here too, and so this is a little bit of some of what I teach and some of what my scholarship is and some of the historical background to some of my work. It was mentioned a minute ago that I was part of the Civil Rights and Civic Virtue Project at Auburn University, Montgomery this past summer. It was super interesting. It was great to go down, tour the Civil Rights Museum. If you ever get the opportunity to do that, it's fantastic. And since this was in Montgomery and we went to Birmingham, the overarching project was to look at what we can learn about civic virtues, virtues that will make our civil society function better from the civil rights movement, because that movement has many things that we can still learn from today. But I'd been working on a paper on the history of the religious exemption to the ADA, and I'll be talking about that more in a little bit. So I've been thinking a lot about the way in which the civil rights movement and the disability rights movement have certain kinds of similarities and certain kinds of differences. My disability course just finished watching last Friday Crip Camp. If you've seen the film, great film. It's up on YouTube legally and the whole thing, thanks to Netflix. Produced by the Obamas. I haven't quite figured out like the connection there, but it's great. And the paper that sort of a lot of this work was the background for about a month ago was accepted, forthcoming in a law journal. I said I'm bad at boundaries. This is the first time going into the law. So private religious schools and disability discrimination. But the main agenda for today, I like to tell my students, this is my agenda, and then I need to cut it back because I usually don't get through everything that I want to. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about the disability rights movement, the history of the disability rights movement, in part because it is much less well known than the civil rights movement and women's suffrage and some of that stuff in the United States. And then with that background, talk about the way that disability discrimination on the grounds of religious freedom both still functions and, interestingly enough, is still legal in the United States. And then, if we get to it, perhaps talk a little bit, and this might just be more for the Q&A, talk about some of the differences in how religious people and institutions have responded to the civil rights movement versus the disability rights movement. And I want to be clear up front that the history of how religious and I'm only going to focus on the United States. That's the history that I know. And so this is right, geographically located. But the history of religious groups with respect to the civil rights movement in the United States, I just have to say, is complicated. One of my favorite photographs, coming to your image. So this is a march during some of the 1960 civil rights protests. You see Catholic, Jews, and Protestants for dignity and brotherhood. So some of the leaders in the civil rights movement were motivated by their religious belief. Perhaps the best known example of this is Martin Luther King Jr. Anybody been to the King Memorial on the National Mall in DC? One of the newest one. What's fascinating about it is King's faith is nowhere mentioned. It doesn't mention that he was a Baptist minister, that he was a reverend. There's no him drawing on scripture at all. So he's kind of been sanitized of his religious beliefs. But here's a picture of him. He's the second from the right. The person next to him is Father Hesburgh. Hesburgh is the Hesburgh Library at Notre Dame. on the side of which is the giant touchdown Jesus picture. And Hesburgh was centrally involved with one of the white religious leaders, Catholic priest, that was involved in the religious support for the civil rights movement. So this is like the part of it that I think, yay, great, you know, like, let's champion that. But Christianity's relationship with the civil rights movement is complicated. You've also got churches that were sites of KKK rallies. This is a fascinating book that I read about a year ago. The Bible Told Them So, how Southern evangelicals fought to preserve white supremacy. And one of the things that I learned about this super interesting history here is that the rise of private religious schools in the United States, the single biggest period of time where there was an increase in the number of private religious schools, was in the lead up and immediate aftermath to the Brown versus Board of Education decision that desegregated public schooling at the federal level. And part of the reason for that was because folks who sent their kids to, at the time, all-white schools that were going to get desegregated, if they had a private religious school, then was going to be exempt from that. When I read that, I was like, this is perhaps a little troubling. So I just want to note from the start, even though I'm going to say that religious organizations in the United States have at least been on the leading edge of some of the civil rights movements, more so than they have on the disability rights movement. Right, that is a very complicated history, and it's not as if we can say religious institutions have been great at this, because the last couple of slides. So I'm going to think about all of these issues in terms of civil rights. I think that in general, a right is something that is due to a person, is owed to somebody, and so we can think about political rights by being in a political community. You have certain opportunities, obligations, perhaps, things that are owed to you. There's such thing as human rights, things that you are due or owed simply in virtue of being human. But civil rights are thought of in virtue of being a member of or participant in a certain civic body. And so in the United States, the civil rights movement was the attempt to legislate certain kinds of treatment and protections for racial minorities that they are due in virtue of being a part of our civic body. And this was, as you probably know, I mean, it still took a long time, but fairly successful, right? You've got the Brown versus Board of Education decision sometime in the 50s, can't remember. The Civil Rights Act passed and goes into effect in 1965. And so the disability rights movement sort of gets started after the civil rights movement. But the disability rights movement saw how successful the civil rights movement had been, and so modeled some of what it was doing specifically on what had already been done, because they thought this was super effective. So we've got kind of a game plan. And the goal of much of the disability rights movement in the United States was to get some kind of federal protection for disabled individuals, much as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed in 64, I don't remember if it's called 64 or 65, gave racial minorities in the United States. 64? Okay.
Yeah. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
No, that's fine.
I'm just thinking to myself when you're saying disability rights, I'm like, why is this so much different, and like, why do I need to know that religious people will be stupid about it?
One reason is because, unfortunately, that's the reality that folks still face today, and in part because in the same way that I think religious folks no longer have certain kinds of legal protections to certain kinds of legal racial discrimination, I'd like to see some of the laws that I'll be talking about here change. So part of this is to try to get folks to close certain legal loopholes that unfortunately allow for religious folks to discriminate.
It's legal loopholes no matter what. I just know that because, well, that's how the world works.
But we can hope to make them better even if they're still not going to be perfect. So that's my goal there.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay. And so the model of this, sort of their goal, and the law that I'm going to talk most about is the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990. But I just want to go and note here that that's not the only federal law that is relevant here. You've also got the, I'll briefly mention Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And there's also what was passed in 1976, I think, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was then updated in 1990, became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is what established in 1976, when it was passed, the first federal right for disabled students to receive a public education in the United States. And when it was passed, there were over 20 states that did not provide public education opportunities for disabled students at the time. So there are other laws besides the Americans with Disabilities Act that give some of these civil protections. But I'm going to focus on the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is actually just a screen capture of part of its website because I think this is helpful. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in everyday activities. And so this law had been structured specifically on earlier civil rights legislation. I always I'm a big reader, I'm a big audiobook listener. I drive my children around a lot of places and I walk our dog a lot, so I'm often listening to audiobooks. 2 books to recommend here, just on the history. The Davis's Enabling Acts, the hidden story of how the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest US minority its right, is a really nice focus on the campaign that would bring about the ADA. In some ways, I like Joseph Shapiro's No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement even better because it's broader. It doesn't look just at the ADA, even though there's a number of chapters on it. So if what I say tonight gives you any historical interest, 2 places to go read. However, some people like movies better than they like books. I already mentioned Crip Camp. Love Crip Camp in part because it connects the disability rights movement with larger cultural trends, connects it with the Woodstock is mentioned a number of times, the sexual revolution of the late 60s, the anti-war protests. So that's, before Crip Camp came out, I used to often show Lives Worth Living. It's a documentary that the PBS station in Boston put, and it is much more specifically just about the lead up to the ADA. The ADA is only about the last 10 or 15 minutes of Crip Camp, and other parts of the movement that I'm talking about came about there. The other thing that I want to notice is a number of to note before I get into some details here, is that a number of scholars have looked at the ways in which disability-based discrimination and racial and sex-based discrimination have been and actually immigration-based discrimination. All 3 of these have been intertwined in the U.S. history. There's a great article I assign my students by historian Leonard Baton, I can't remember his first name, that one of the leading arguments given against the emancipation of slaves in US history, and this is what I often say in class, I'm reporting, not endorsing, was that African Americans were not biologically constituted for freedom, and so if they were emancipated, they would become disabled because they just can't handle freedom. And a lot of advocates of abolition would say, no, that's not true. Maybe disabled folks shouldn't have rights, but slaves should have rights. Similar thing happened in the early parts of the 20th century with the women's suffrage movement. If we give women the right to vote, we'd want them to vote well, but women aren't just constituted to receive the education and enable them to have the good right to vote and to use it well. And a lot of suffragettes were just like, no, maybe disabled folks shouldn't have the right to vote, but we're not like them, right? And so there are ways in which ableism, sexism, racism have been intertwined. There are parts of US history that fears of becoming disabled were sufficient to deny you immigration status in the United States. These are actually super recent, by the way. Some of them are still in the books. But Lamar Hardwick, an autistic Black pastor, has a really nice book that talks about how ableism and racism are interconnected. And this just came out about a year ago, so I think this is my last book recommendation as I go. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, you had then folks wanting to take that movement and use it to get other kinds of civil rights protections. The gay pride movement had actually tried to use it to get anti-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And so you had disabled activists starting to think the same kind of thing. One of the authors of the Civil Rights Act, Hubert Humphrey, once it was passed, started writing an amendment that would then extend the protections of the Civil Rights Act to include disability status. But they felt that would be too controversial, and so they opposed the change. The worry was that if we expand civil rights protections beyond just race, it'll dilute the effectiveness of the act. So then in 1974, you have the Rehabilitation Act that is written and passed. And the history here is, I think, fascinating. You can tell I'm bad at, right? I've basically just done history so far. I'm bad at boundaries. There, at the very end of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, somebody adds on, I think it's 46 words. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody now knows who did it. The bill that they were going back and forth between Senate and Congress, the early versions didn't have this last section, and then somewhere before it got signed, somebody just like added it, and then it was signed and became law. This is section 504. This is those of you that are familiar with 504 plans in public schools. So they added these words: no otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States, as defined in section 7.6, shall solely by reason of his handicap be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so since in the United States, most education dollars come from either local property taxes or federal education dollars doled out to states, divvied up to districts, at this point, districts, in order to continue to receive those education dollars, or institutions, I suspect, like Muskegon Community College that receives federal funds, had to start, right? If you received federal funds, you had to stop denying access on the basis of disability status. So this is the first federal civil rights protections for disabled students, for disabled individuals in the United States, 1973. I was born in 1975, right? Like this is, I mean, it's getting longer ago, but like not all that long ago. And so one of the concerns, and this was seen as a big step forward, but one of the concerns was it only works for programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. And so any private institution could either legally discriminate on the basis of disability status or would not have to make any kinds of accommodations to allow access, et cetera, et cetera. So the disability rights activists wanted to take this and expand it just beyond the narrow scope of receiving federal financial help and make it broader. And one of the places that they looked early on was, I mean, I think this is kind of weird, but in the same way that the civil rights movement focused on public transportation, this is a picture of the Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. Right? Like if you don't have good transportation to get to work, work is hard. And so public transportation was seen as a first step towards getting various kinds of access to work. And the bus boycotts in the civil rights movement were super effective. And since they were effective, disabled activists thought, let's have our own boycotts. So this is a picture of a bus boycott in Denver by a still existing disability rights group called ADAPT. And what they would do, because buses didn't have access for physically disabled folks, they would go and park their wheelchairs around the parked buses. And those folks that were using power chairs, they'd like turn off the power, disconnect the batteries, right? And of course, people that were trying to take the bus to get to work got upset, but this is a way of mobilizing support. And so then you start having federal transportation and interstate transportation agencies looking at the right for disabled folks to have access to public transportation in the mid-70s. This is a picture of ADAPT from, I believe, let's see, what year is it, 2024, from about 6 years ago. One of the goals in President Trump's agenda was the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act makes it so you can't be denied insurance coverage on the basis of pre-existing conditions. Disabilities are pre-existing conditions. When I moved from my university in Southern California to Idaho, we have a 16-year-old who's multiply disabled. And it took months of negotiation to make sure that my new job before I accepted it that I would be able to get health insurance through them, because technically the health insurance company that my new employer had wouldn't have to cover our son, and we're not going to move if we can't get insurance coverage for our son. When we moved then from Idaho to Grand Rapids in 2016, the Affordable Care Act is in place. We don't have to give any thought to it. And so if part of the Trump administration's agenda was the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, this is the same group of folks that got some of those early bus boycotts going. So, and again, power chairs can weigh up to 300 pounds. And if you pull them and you put on the brake and you disconnect the battery, and sometimes what they would do, they'd actually lock their power chairs to like buses, and bus drivers are probably unlikely to take off if it would mean dragging. Hopefully they would not take off if it would mean dragging. So again, this is a way in which this is modeled off of civil rights sit-ins. So again, the ways in which the disability rights movement learned from the civil rights movement still happening to this day. And so the goal then was to try and make that even more explicit. One of the other speakers at the Civil Rights Civic Virtue project that I was at gave their talk on the way in which the various kinds of chants functioned in the civil rights movement and the various kinds of slogans. And I love this picture, access is a civil right, but we shall overcome, which was one of the songs that was often sang during the civil rights movement, both as a religious song, but using religious songs and imagery to motivate the centrality of the civil rights movement. And so you see here, right, the exact same language using. If these things were effective there, let's continue to use them. And so they were getting traction in the 70s for perhaps having some kind of federal legislation that would enact at a broad scale what the Rehabilitation Act had done for federally funded institutions that received federal funding. And then in the 80s, along came Reagan. Reagan had as part of his agenda during his first term the elimination of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act as a first step to try and undo the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so you had about 10, 15 years of making progress, and then suddenly, right, the realization that this was very controversial for reasons that is kind of unclear. So they didn't succeed in either eliminating 504 under Reagan or repealing the Civil Rights Act. But Reagan's vice president, George H. Bush? H.W.? I can never remember which is the H.W.? Okay. Bush Sr., as I sometimes call him. Becomes the Republican candidate for president. Anybody remember what Bush's campaign slogan was?
No, I don't know.
It was in terms of being a compassionate conservative. And then he would go back and talk to his staff, I don't know what this means. And so they were looking for some kind of legislation that would give them, right, clarity of what that would actually look like. And they came across and endorsed in a way that I'm sure the Gipper, Reagan, would not have found, this push to have a federal Civil Rights Legislation Act to be the founding, the hallmark legislation of Bush's compassionate conservative agenda. And one of the interesting things about the push for this is it was both a Republican and a Democratic push. So you had the central authors of what became the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, were bipartisan. It took about 6 years of campaigning in order for it to be finalized. There were all kinds of debates about what sorts of financial costs institutions should have to bear, and worries that it would bankrupt businesses, and that one of the concerns that was often leveraged was that you would have lawyers that would just go around getting really, really rich on prosecuting folks for ADA violations. You can get legal fees. You can't be awarded damages even if you succeed in finding an ADA violation against somebody. So maybe the lawyers would get rich, nobody else would get rich. But Bush in then 1990 signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And when it was signed, it was the largest public signing of legislation to date in the Rose Garden at the White House. And part of what Bush said when he signed the legislation is this. He's making reference explicitly both to the civil rights movement and also to the fall of the Berlin Wall that had happened just a few years earlier. So this is Bush. With today's signing of the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, freedom. As I look around these joyous faces, I remember clearly how many years of dedicated commitment have gone into making this historic new Civil Rights Act a reality. So even Bush is framing it as a Civil Rights Act. This historic act is the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. Britain would pass a similarly modeled law within 2 years. It will ensure that people with disabilities are given the basic guarantees for which they have worked so hard and so long: independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, the opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of the American mainstream. Legally, it will provide our disabled community with a powerful expansion of protections and then basic civil rights. It'll guarantee fair and just access to the fruits of American life, which we all must enjoy. And then to make this explicit to sort of the centrality of the American dream and the fight against communism and the recent fall of the Berlin Wall. This is a picture of punks at the literal fall of the Berlin Wall. Not punks in the derogatory sense, like punks in the good sense. We rejoice as this barrier falls, for claiming together we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America on your behalf, as well as the behalf of this entire country. I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disabilities Act, and I say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down, and it's passed, and then magically overnight, all the problems disabled people face in our society is fixed. I like the laughter there, by the way.
No one is
I know.
There's still a lot of problems. As someone who has autism, ADHD, and diabetes, I can say, there's still a whole bunch of problems.
I completely agree with you. I'm going to talk about some of those problems. So I was being sarcastic there. One of the things that I love, my wife calls me a jackass for justice because, like, I think this is a compliment. But I love that if you find an ADA violation, the place to report it is the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And actually, a couple weeks ago, I had our youngest at cross-country practice, and once every couple weeks, they go to a local park, and they run hills at the park. And when we were there, I noticed that it did not have compliant ADA parking. I happen to know the parking laws reasonably well. So I sent an email to the director of Parks and Recreation for Grand Rapids. I said, hey, I was at this park, noticed that it is not ADA compliant. The bathroom also is not ADA compliant. I would like a plan within 2 weeks of what your time frame for actually making it compliant is, or I will file a complaint here. I look forward to hearing from you by September 25th. It's today. Got an email from them today. Here is our, like the steps we are going to take and when, and they've already contacted contractors.
Yeah.
Right? It is a parking lot. I actually have already done the same thing for about 10 businesses in Grand Rapids. Numerous city public parking lots are in violation, et cetera. This is the number of lawsuits that are filed under the ADA every year. So like you can lodge a complaint as a first step to being able to follow a lawsuit. You've got somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 filed every year. So like clearly there are problems. What's fascinating to me is that the person who files them wins the case in less than 20% of the cases. So they're vastly unsuccessful. I think the ADA is not strong enough. It doesn't have enough teeth. It requires enforcement. The only way to basically force somebody to live up to the ADA is through the complaint process. In the same way that the only way to get public schools to actually follow IDEA is if you file a state or federal complaint against them. I read something recently that described IDEA as the only federal law that is enforced by parents. Unfortunately, that's often the case. Right, so the ADA I don't think goes far enough, but one of the big loopholes in it is in the push for it in the same way that businesses wanted to be exempt because they didn't want to have to spend the money, religious organizations lobbied to be exempt. And I do not know of any actual religious organizations that were lobbying on behalf of their inclusion in the ADA. So the history of religious groups and racial segregation is complicated. This is less complicated because more uniformly bad. There's a letter to the White House in arguing why religious entities should be exempt from the ADA. Let me find this part.
Why does a church need to be exempt?
So here's the reasons they gave. They gave a number of reasons. This letter gives 4. Bob Dole archives on the web, great to find. One is it's going to cost us too much, right? But like Starbucks could have made the same argument and they're just going to tell Starbucks, too bad, you have to do it anyway. This letter is written in mid-'89. The late 80s are also in our country the height of the AIDS scare. At the time, who was the primary subpopulation that was thought to have AIDS, to be successful to HIV status?
Homosexuals.
Gay people,
Yeah.
specifically gay men. And so one of the parts in this argument that's actually made like on paper is if churches are held to the ADA, then they won't be able to fire gay clergy. And gay clergy might like be HIV positive.
Well, that's not how HIV even spreads. What the hell?
I'm just reporting, right? And another was that there are no problems in churches. Like, churches are great for disabled folks. not quite how anybody knows. William Bentley Ball was one of the leading lawyers on behalf of the religious exemption. William Bentley Ball is also the lawyer that is the head lawyer in the Wisconsin v. Yoder legal decision to get Amish folks to not have to follow compulsory state education laws in Pennsylvania. So a big proponent of religious freedom. Oh, here's my slide about fight AIDS, not guns, right? This is part of the way in which certain kinds of fears of certain kinds of folks that happen to be largely marginalized are leveraged often to increase other kinds. But in that letter, it is written, nothing can be clearer than the free exercise of religion will be seriously impaired by imposing the ADA on religious bodies. Nothing has been shown to indicate that there is a national necessity to apply the ADA bill to churches, religious schools, ministries. We don't see a problem. That absence of evidence is by itself indicates religious organizations are by and large within their means. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, those of you that are. And in keeping with their compassionate traditions, acting to protect and accommodate persons with disabilities. And now that I know the history of all this, right, the proper response to this is just like BS. Nobody really thought this. Couldn't have thought this. But they succeeded. Religious organizations, churches, mosques, synagogues, and their schools are legally exempt because they are not public accommodations, they are private. In the same way that actually technically golf clubs that you have to golf, not the clubs, but like the place you belong to play golf. I don't play golf. Golf clubs? Okay. If it is private and you have to pay a membership fee, it is exempt from the ADA. Because it's not a public accommodation. And so what happens then is churches don't have to be ADA compliant. Churches are often used as voting places. If a church doesn't have to be ADA compliant and you are supposed to vote at, right, like I'm not quite sure how this is supposed to work. Religious schools don't have to make accommodations for, accept, be willing to not discriminate against disabled students on the basis of disability. One of the reasons I care about this, so our son used to go to a religious school, private Christian school, and at one point they're just like, his disabilities are too hard for us to deal with, he's no longer welcome.
Bullshit.
Roughly, that's my take. That's actually slightly nicer than what usually runs through my head. And they can.
What about discrimination? I've said some really vulgar stuff today about it.
So I do think that there are appropriate places for vulgarity. My children know this, but we're not going to get into all of them right now. Religious schools, I mentioned earlier that religious schools, the highest sort of rise in them was in the lead up to and passage of Brown versus Board of Education. Technically, you can have a private religious school that discriminates on the basis of race now. However, if you do, thanks to the, let me see if I can get the name of the, Bob Jones University versus, what's the tax organization? The IRS. The IRS passed, I think this was in the late 80s, new recommendations that anybody that discriminated again in ways prohibited by federal law could not be given tax-exempt status. Bob Jones University had a ban on interracial dating at the time. They sued the IRS for taking away their tax-exempt status, and the Supreme Court sided with the IRS. So even though Bob Jones University could continue to discriminate on the basis of race, now it would cost them $1 million a year in tax-exempt status. So what they do? They got rid of their non-interracial dating policy. So even though in some ways it is still legal, the federal law gives a certain kind of financial incentive to not discriminate on the basis of race for private religious organizations. And there is no such thing in the case for disability. So one of the things that I think could be good is if we modeled the disability one on the civil rights one. There has been a number of increasing cases related to employment in churches. So the Title I of the ADA is about employment. Title III is about sort of like physical access of buildings and ramps and door openers. And Title IV is about touch-tone telephones. And part of that is why we now have widespread closed captioning, which is great. Religious organizations that have 15 or more people do have to follow Title I of the ADA about employment unless the people that it employs are considered ministers. And if they're considered ministers, because of the First Amendment, the free exercise clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution, simply saying that it is a ministerial requirement gets any kind of anti-discrimination suit thrown out of federal court. So unsurprisingly, the range of folks that churches, private religious schools think of as ministers has increased. There's a case won by the Catholic school that involved that. I'm not going to remember the court case. But one of their teachers was pregnant. Pregnancy can actually be a protected disability status under the ADA. They fired the teacher for being pregnant. She sued under the ADA for for disability discrimination. The school said, part of what she does, part of what we expect for her is to pray with students. It's a private Christian school. We think of her as a minister even though she's not a chaplain, right? And the case was thrown out. Still happens. So there's ways in which there are protections for employment on the basis of this. But it's all rooted in this idea of religious freedom. The government will not establish a religion and will not prevent the exercise of religion. And so simply saying that it is a religious, you don't even have to give a religious reason for the discrimination. You just have to say, we discriminate. Oh yeah, and by the way, we're also religious. And you can get away with it in the disability case. Next, I got a little ahead of myself. Sometimes happens. This is the Loverings. They sued the state of Virginia that initially denied them the ability to marry because they're an interracial couple. It was this decision that then led the IRS to make the change that led to the Bob Jones University versus Virginia, or versus IRS case that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So even if Bob Jones University were to say, we have religious reasons that justify racial discrimination, the government would say, too bad, you still get no tax exempt status. A religious organization can say, we are officially committed to non-discrimination on the basis of disability status, and still claim religious freedom to discriminate, even though it's contrary to their official theology, and merely making the claim is sufficient for getting the case thrown out. So what I do in the paper that I mentioned came out of this is I suggest we ought to do at least one of two things. One, hold religious organizations to the same status that we hold with respect to disability-based discrimination that we do on the basis of racial discrimination. Maybe it's illegal to do it, but should it cost you your tax-exempt status? And maybe that would motivate a few of them. The other thing, the other suggestion, and we could do both of these. The other suggestion is to say that make them actually make it explicit that they are claiming it as part of their religion to discriminate. They probably don't want to do that. But if they could say it's our official theology that disabled people are like less valuable, right, then it would make sense for the religious exemption. But Calvin University, where I teach, is owned by the Christian Reformed Church. Denomination is fairly prominent in West Michigan. In the legal documents arguing for the religious exemption to the ADA, there's a list of religious institutions that say we should be exempt. And the CRC is listed on there from 1989. Within 3 years of passing of the ADA, there's a committee in the CRC that says the church should be held to a higher moral standard than The government is. And so there's an internal document that was approved by their legislative body and is now official position of the CRC from 1993 that disability-based discrimination has no place in their theology and that all of their institutions should be fully ADA compliant by 1996. And it's not happened, right? So legally, the CRC has the right to discriminate on the basis of disability for religious reasons, even though it is directly in conflict with what they say their actual theology is. And that, to me, seems like a really big disconnect that, like, maybe we should do something about. So that was to get through my first 2 points that I wanted to. That's been about 45, 50-ish minutes. So I will then, we can come back and talk about some of the differences between how the church has responded in the racial civil rights cases versus the disability civil rights cases. But for here, I'll stop. Thank you for enjoying the history here. I guess I just assumed that you enjoyed it. Sorry, maybe that's a bad assumption. Thank you for tolerating the history here. There we go. Maybe that's a better.
All right. Is this a main time? So, yeah, like my question is like, what about other religions? And is it just that isn't it like just Christianity gets away with it because it's just big, because it's big as hell, or is it like, no, this is just everyone who does this and it's so freaking stupid?
So legally, it's not just Christianity that has the right, it's any religious organization that has the right. There were some Jewish schools and Jewish organizations that also signed off to oppose. I am not aware, so from the late 1980s, I am not aware of a National Islamic Association that was involved in the push to be exempt from the ADA. So I think largely it's primarily Christian organizations that you see in this because that's just the dominant religious organizations in the United States in the late 80s. For me, as somebody that is Christian, or at least tries to be, probably not a good one. Right? This bothers me because it seems to be fundamentally antithetical to the way. So I'm especially bothered by Christianity because it has the largest social capital and it's the group that I know best that I think should be unwilling to do this. But as I understand it, Sikhs or Muslims or Hindus or any other group can do the same kind of move. And I do know that there are cases involving Jewish private schools that have functioned sort of like the ones that I've mentioned here. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. No.
As a Christian professor at a Christian university, do you get blowback from your peers or other people in leadership for taking what some might view as a combative stance?
So far, no.
Oh, good.
In part because our official theology says that this is what we should do, right? And I try to leverage that. When this law paper comes out and I give it to my dean as part of my scholarship, and there's literally a section that takes the CRC as one of the examples. I'm pretty sure that they're going to support me, right? Because I think that they agree on the claim. So I have not yet gotten any official pushback, and I am thankful for that. I have noticed that, so this is not the only kind of disability issue that I think about, the legal cases. I have noticed in some ways that when I point out, say, structural ableism, Christians, in my experience, tend to get defensive faster on this issue, in part because Christianity often thinks that what's in our heart matters, and so they move to what I call the curse of good intentions. Well, I didn't mean to, and in a sense, it doesn't matter if you meant, in one sense, I would rather you kick me in the shin accidentally than on purpose, but in both cases it hurts and might need, right, depending on how hard you kick. So I haven't got any pushback from my institution. I have been told we need to not make this super, and not officially from my institution, but like having these conversations, right? Like we should work to change this, but like not talk too loud about it. And for me, right, the civil rights movement happened precisely because public opinion and action was leveraged. And I'm working on a paper right now, what I call the Vice of West Michigan Nice. I'm not from West Michigan, I'm from Ohio. But there's a way that in the culture, as I see it here in West Michigan, and I've got a Canadian friend that says there's a Canadian version of this too. The ways in which sort of niceness gets weaponized to keep the status quo going. And so I have seen this, right? Like, oh, we can't talk about the church having this problem because it'll make us look bad. And it's just like, but the problem is that it does it, not that like it makes it look bad. So fortunately, I've not gotten in trouble yet. Hopefully it continues. But I have had a lot of interpersonal pushback by various folks. And, you know, we had a long history with the school that kicked out our son. One of our daughters still goes to that district now, right? And it's a really complicated relationship. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I work for our local Center for Independent Living.
Okay.
Doing advocacy work, and you talk about facilities that aren't ADA compliant, and one of the things that we're trying to push now is that the ADAs, we tell people that's legally the worst you can do. That's like hitting a B on your report card. And, you're barely passing right there. That we're trying to push actually moving towards universal design. But however, the ADA's been passed for 34 years, and you could walk around and find hundreds of places within a mile of your house that are not compliant. What are your ideas for having the ADA have more teeth or moving beyond that when there's still so much work that needs to be done to even get to a bare minimum standard?
There's a place in Crip Camp where Judy Heumann, one of the disability rights advocates at the center of the film, once the ADA is passed and she is sort of on the national speaking opportunity or something, she says something like, I shouldn't have to sort of be so thankful that I now have the legal right to a bathroom. Right? We now have the law, but it doesn't change people's hearts. So the law, as you said, is the bare minimum, but oftentimes the bare minimum doesn't happen. One of the things that I think is a problem is that there really is no enforcement teeth. So when I file a complaint against Starbucks or Pizza Hut or Krispy Kreme, or these are all business, right? The City of Grand Rapids or the Parts and Rec Division, then maybe, depending on how much staff the Civil Rights Division has, would actually look into it. They will recommend mediation because then it doesn't have to go through the legal procedures. They can just sort of, right? But the mediation, in my experience, has no teeth, and now I always reject it. The best case scenario that you could do by bringing a suit under the ADA is your judgment would be that whatever is the violation would get fixed, and your legal fees, if you win, will be covered. And so in a sense, right, like businesses have incentives to do as little as possible, because basically the most they're gonna have to do is like catch up and do it.
And litigation usually takes years.
Yep.
Before they even hear about it.
Yes. So one of the things that I would like is there to be like, right, financial penalties against institutions that are found to be in violation. In the same way that if you are found to be in violation of EPA regulations, right, they don't just make you pay to clean it up. Your organization can be fined millions of dollars, or right, tax violations or something like. Let's have the same kind of financial teeth to this. And we might actually need then somebody whose actual job is to go around and look for this, right? One of the things that also frustrates me is not just how parking lots are designed, right, and not compliant, but the percentage of times where you see somebody that has neither the accessible placard or an accessible plate that parks in them. And it's almost always like, we're here for 2 minutes. Like, your 2 minutes adds up to a lot more of some of our time. And so folks, when I talk about how common this is, they're like, call the police, right? Call like the non-emergency number. And I have never, in all the years I've been doing this sort of stuff, when I've called, right, like they're not going to send out a patrol car to come and give a ticket to somebody who's parked in ADA compliant, because there's, right, nobody whose jobs they see as going around and doing it. In principle, ADA violations are supposed to be able to get you from getting building code inspections passed. But oftentimes it's right, they don't know what the codes actually are and aren't looking super closely. And right, so we need an actual enforcement organization, and we need there to be financial teeth or folks aren't going to do it.
Yeah, I do accessibility review work, and I've done probably upwards of 40 facilities, parks, nonprofits, businesses. I've never been anywhere that was fully, even places that were brand new.
Yeah. In part because, again, they've got financial incentives and or ignorance, right? Sometimes people just don't know any better. But sometimes they don't want to do it because universal design often takes more space and increases square footage, et cetera, et cetera. And so your experience is not at all surprising to me.
Yeah. So you've been talking a lot about disability, and you've been using a lot of physical disability as representations of that. And a lot of the movements seem to be centered around those physical disabilities. But I feel as though there is sort of a disparity or a difference between the physical and mental disability community and how much they are represented in these kind of issues, where it's very easy to see somebody with a wheelchair failing to get up the stairs. It is less easy to see somebody with autism, ADHD, these kind of disabilities failing to achieve some sort of academic, financial, or career success. How can we, just as an example, I regularly put in applications to places that use these personality evaluations. These are blatant discriminatory tactics, and I don't see simple ways to, I mean, they're so widespread, you can't just go to your local business or your local government and say, hey, this is an issue, because they're nationally spread. How can we begin to approach tackling these huge, be it online or just larger institutional issues that are discriminating against people with less visible disabilities?
Yeah, great question. It should not be surprising that it was primarily folks with physical disabilities that in many ways were spearheading the disability rights movement, because they were largely concerned about independent living and or the ability to get into various kinds of places, right? Physical access. And so in part, but there's lots to say there that I'm going to resist for the moment. But so when I talk with my students about like designing for access, physical access is a key part. But the ways in which neurodivergent folks, I don't think that all mental illnesses disable and not all disabilities involve mental illness, but there's a fair bit of overlap. In part because if you're autistic and or ADHD or other kind, the likelihood that you encounter frustrating things is really, really high, so you're more likely to be anxious or depressed, so part of it is just a correlation.
Well, I would also say that the more people are willing to accommodate, the less it feels like a disability to begin with.
Yeah, so oftentimes this is the social model of disability. What disables us isn't the thing about our body, but the social environment, right? Judy Heumann talks about in Crip Camp, this is a paraphrase, but like the fact that she's a wheelchair user isn't what prevented her, right? The fact that her legs didn't work from polio isn't what prevented her from getting an education. It was that her local public school wouldn't take her, right? So it's disabled by the community rather than by the physical body. And because certain kinds of disabilities are less visible, right, invisible disabilities, they're often called, it is harder to do that. So to get to the heart of your question, I think what it's going to actually take, and I've actually seen some scholarship on this now, arguing specifically that these sorts of online personality tests, whether or not intentionally, end up discriminating against neurodivergent folks. And the data supporting that is pretty high. So what it might take is a class action suit against a national retailer that uses it. I mean, I don't like the way to get this stuff addressed being the law. It'd be nice if people just saw the right thing to do and did it, right? But sometimes the law is your only stick. There's no carrot. Really, they're not often seen like a carrot right? So it might take something like a class action suit against Best Buy or Walmart or Meijer. I'm not trying to pick on these companies, right? But like a national organization that uses these very, very highly in order to get folks to realize the problem, and then to not allow those kinds of tests to be used, which do in fact discriminate in the hiring process against neurodivergent folks. And again, getting the legal protections only a necessary first step. Right, to paraphrase Judy Heumann again, right? Legal access isn't going to change hearts and minds. One of the reasons I teach a class at Calvin regularly, teaching it right now on disability, is if we can sort of shape people's understanding, and right, that like eventually, right, and stuff has gotten better since the ADA was passed. It's not great, but at least, right, in general, it's better. So often right, as time goes, these things, but it's not guaranteed, right? With Reagan, we saw that it almost got, right, the protections almost got lost. So there's, I think, one of the things that we can do is just raise awareness. I spend a whole week talking about neurodivergence and neurodivergent spaces. There's a great paper that I use that talks about social ramps in the same way that physical ramps grant access. We can structure our social engagements so that it gives access to more people. And I think that that's a great metaphor. So there's a number, right? But I think that it's probably not gonna succeed at the wider level until somebody successfully brings a suit. There are a number of people, I mentioned Meijer a minute ago, because it's right, big local corporation. Meier's actually got one of the best disability hiring programs for a national organization in the country, according to data. And it all happened because one of their directors of one of their supply chain or distribution centers had a disabled child and wanted to get a job for them, and then realized, oh shoot, right? And if I remember right, it's been a few years since I've heard the story, but I think it was an autistic child. And then start like, he's a great worker if we have the right conditions. And so there's at least when I heard from the guy that had done this, there was a Meijer distribution center that had like an 80% disability rate of its employees. And then that got used to change other Meijer distribution centers, and he also did work for CVS and various kinds of. So another way to get it is to get somebody in an influential role that then sort of like forces it on it.
Yeah, I feel like that, just to make a point on that, it's a little disparaging that it always seems to be somebody who knows somebody who's disabled, as opposed to that's why I work closely with ASAN, which is the
autism
self-advocacy network. Because they are disabled people who fight for disabled people, but that always does seem to be the story.
Yeah, I mean, in part because the marginalized often don't have the power to enforce this, right? The kind of social. I'm a huge proponent of ASAN, right? Love their work. Recommend my students go to them when they've got interest, right? I'm not autistic. I've got a friend who's involved in ASAN in another state. Unfortunately, sometimes when he says things, right, like there's absolutely no uptake in certain social spaces, and then I say what he just said, and suddenly, right, and so this gets tricky in all sorts of ways, right? I don't want to be if you're familiar with the language of white savior, right, I don't want to be like the neurotypical savior, but part of what you can do is leverage what privilege you do have to amplify the voices of the folks that aren't being heard. Next week at Calvin, I'm running a 2-day workshop on ableism in the academy, the way in which academic institutions are structured in ways that are often problematic for disabled students, faculty, and or staff. And I'm bringing in 7 speakers to Calvin, and I'm going to record the whole thing, and so eventually it'll all be up on website, and so like, part of me is I just want to motivate my own institution to get better, even though on the scale of institutions, and of those 7 folks that I'm bringing in, at least 6 of them are disabled. I don't know about the other. I know their work, I think it's great, right? And the way in which what I can do is leverage the opportunities that I can give to amplify those sorts of voices. In part because I don't want it to be the phenomena that you just, right, you just mentioned. But it gets tricky because short of making myself neurodiverse, anything that I do is going to be as a neurotypical person, right? And so there's just lots of delicate ways that has to be done. But the central, I haven't said this at this point of the talk, the central motto of the disability rights movement was nothing about us without us. Non-disabled people don't get to say what we need. And this is, right, the exact motto. This is why the Autism Self-Advocacy Network is better than Autism Speaks.
In a lot of ways.
Because at its heart has always been disabled voices and disabled leadership. So, preaching to the choir here, if you're familiar with, I mean, if you don't mind the choir reference. But
Autism Speaks also has some really nasty skeletons.
yes, they do, right? So it's not the only problem with them, but one of their problems is, right, the history of excluding autistic folks from any kind of fundamental role. So, yes, the sentiment behind your question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm ashamed to admit I'm a raving baby now that you showed all that, especially being a freshman here finally in MCC. I did wait a long time. But, you know, this presentation today, I finally decided, you know, a sociology major, I plan to progress beyond MCC and hopefully even teach it post-secondary. But I'm curious to know where, you know, philosophy classes, I plan to take a few of them at least, but I want to know where I can sort of integrate that into, you know, a sociology approach to spread awareness and just help one at a time.
So if you were to ask me what is the best discipline that is prepared to actually make a difference in disabled folks' lives, I'm not going to say philosophy. There's great work in philosophy that's being done, right? But some of my best students that get this the most are sociology students, social work students. We've got a big pre-therapy program, and right, I want to get the folks that are going to be speech and language pathologists, physical therapists, occupational therapists to realize some of the ways in which their disciplines tend to be, right, discriminatory or problematic towards disabled folks, and to rethink how they're doing. So I think that right, sociology is probably one of the disciplines that actually most of, in addition to history, sort of the approach that I've been doing here today most aligns with. I'm not a sociologist, so I can't tell you like what are the good programs that have, right, like the only sociology program I actually know is Calvin's, and actually I work very closely with a number of our sociology faculty to make sure that this kind of, Calvin has a core, do you guys have a core requirement here that there's like, in order to get any degree here, there's certain distribution of classes here? So one of Calvin's core requirements is a class on diversity and difference. And my disability course counts because the university sees disability as a part of human difference and diversity that needs to be taken seriously. And I get all sorts of uptake from sociologists. Now, what that would look like at other institutes, I don't know.
Well, and I mean, I thank God every day that it's not blatantly obvious I have brain cancer. So, but I'm still disabled.
Mm-hmm.
I still have to get up every day and go to school and do my homework
Yep.
and everything else. If epilepsy wants to, you know, pop in and visit for the day, I don't have to say it.
Yep.
But you know, MCC, I will say, has been very accommodating, very welcoming, and I haven't regretted it the day I
Good. One of the fascinating things, you're not surprised that I find many things fascinating about the ADA. One of the fascinating things about the ADA is it gives 3 conditions under which you're disabled. You've got a bodily impairment that gets in the way of a major life activity. You've got a history of such an impairment. So just because, right, if somebody is in cancer remission, you don't want to be able to be fired because you no longer have cancer, but because you used to have cancer, right? So the historical clause is put in exactly for that reason. So actual impairment, history of an impairment. I had a TBI a few years ago. I had a not so smart moment on a bike, right? TBI, I had to take a couple of weeks off for concussion. Technically, I satisfy the second criteria. Third criteria is super fascinating, where people think you have an impairment that disables. And the interest, right, the reason that was done is if you're looking to protect people's employment opportunities, right? People with burns or facial scarring or something like that that might not actually get in the way of, right, but just have a certain kind of stigma or visceral reaction. It was on purpose to include those folks, right? Which is really interesting. You might have a legal protection not because of anything about you, but just because of other people's beliefs. But the second condition was put in there exactly for things like cancer treatment, which is one of the things that ADA gets right.
Got a couple of questions, but I'm trying to figure out which one to ask. But I guess I'll start with this one. We talked a little bit about money and the cost of being ADA compliant. Do some churches argue, or do you think that there should be government funding or more government funding than been made available for nonprofits or even for-profits or to spend the money to become more compliant?
Good question. Answer is, I don't know, because I'd have to think through sort of what I think is a good systematic approach to government, right, block grant funding for various kinds of, right, what I see as social justice improvements. So, not sure. Depending on what the purpose of the nonprofit is, I might be more willing to encourage, right, that. But I mean, nonprofits can be for all sorts of reasons, right? Religious organizations can only, as one instance, can only care about the folks in their religious organization. And so not all nonprofits are going to be equal in this way, so I'd probably want to figure out what the good the nonprofit is trying to do. I mean, in one sense, for-profit business, I think that profits ought not take precedent over certain fundamental human rights. So even if, right, racial desegregation was going to cost businesses some profits, right? Tough. If disability discrimination is going to cost, right, Krispy Kreme's got to restrip their parking lot or change the threshold because it doesn't meet ADA code, in a sense, kind of tough. Retrofitting buildings is different than the new construction, right? So again, there are ways in which this gets really, really complicated. So beyond that, I don't know how I'd want to answer. I've only got one paper that deals with public policy, and it's about educational policy. Actually, 3 papers now that deal with educational policy. But, so I don't know. Good question, right? Like, we need smart people with good training and backgrounds to think about those sorts of questions.
I got a second one.
Okay, let me just.
But if there's others.
Yep, so I'll come back.
Just brief. I think you kind of jumped to an answer earlier, and one of the answers you were giving, or one of the recommendations you gave was having kind of a government agency that goes around trying to enforce or make sure that buildings are up to compliance, and then enforcing when buildings and companies aren't in compliance monetarily, putting a fine on that. And that's a self-funding system you just came up with right there, and I think that could apply to what you just talked about. I mean, I think that's a great system. That makes a lot of sense. Just a little caveat there.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, maybe those two things come together. And again, like if you were to say, hey, Kevin, you come up with a federal, right, Department of ADA compliance, no, I'm the wrong person to do that. All right, but there are lots of ways. It would have to be done in the right way, because anytime you have somebody, right, an organization that generates its own revenue stream, right? This is part of the problem with the way that a lot of police forces work. This is part of the problem with Ferguson. I used to live in St. Louis, is that the vast majority of the Ferguson police budget came from tickets and fines. And then that encourages them to find more and more, and of course, right, like they weren't looking racially equally. I could probably drive through Ferguson and not have, right, like the likelihood that I would get pulled over in Ferguson just statistically is a lot lower than racial minority. So I do worry that there are ways in which the self-funding could then encourage other kinds of biases to be more prevalent. So we have to do it carefully. But like, where do we get the money for the IRS? Taxes, right? And there seems to be, for the sake of the common good, certain things that are worth doing well. And if it is really for the common good, we all should contribute to it in some kind of way. And so, again, I'm not in principle opposed to that. But like what the details would look like, I'm no economist. I'm no, right? Like, we need lots of folks from lots of disciplines, lots of expertise to figure that out.
About a half an hour before your talk began, I was coming here, and I suggested to a friend that I asked a friend whether there are some limits to the amount of healthcare services we old people, use a different term, should be getting, and suggested that a lot of money is going towards, it seems to me, a lot of money is going to people like me, and not people like a son or a child or poor people. Mm-hmm. You would acknowledge that resources are finite.
I would.
Are there some people who would really benefit from some disabilities changes in our society, but where the cost seems more prohibitive to you in a morally justifiable way?
Yeah. So I'm teaching this disability course. The other class that I'm teaching, this is my first semester teaching it, is a course on justice and the common good. So I'm thinking about these sorts of, certainly we can't fund everything through taxes, right? Because resources are finite. You can't, or at least let me put it this way, you ought not repeatedly spend more than, right, your income stream. So there are, again, like with other, there are going to be really hard questions. One of the philosophers that I'm teaching this semester is John Rawls, probably the most influential political philosopher in the English-speaking world the past 50 years. And he thinks that justice is a kind of procedural fairness, right? So we can't appeal to like special details about ourselves, right? Christianity doesn't get to get treated differently than another religion just because I like Christians or happen to self-identify or something. So you got to be able to give reasons that everybody from what he calls behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing specific details about you, would be willing to give. That's his first rule for how justice is fairness work. The second one is any inequality can only be justified by what it does for the disadvantaged, not the overly advantaged, right? And so that would, Rawls's approach gives us a way to think about, right, prioritizing resources to those folks that are on the more disadvantaged end. And I think that there, right, so there are all sorts of things. Despite liking the fact that I was guaranteed to get insurance coverage at Calvin when I came because of the Affordable Care Act, our son gets, has a prescription for weekly speech, OT, PT. And one year I made the mistake of like adding up what all the co-pays and the deductible costs for his therapy prescriptions would be, and it was over $8,000. And I don't have an extra $8,000. Right? So even at the personal level, we had to prioritize certain kinds of things. And so the way in which hard calls have to be made about scarce resources, I agree.
At the societal level as well.
Yep, definitely.
If I can just throw in, I listened to NPR on the way here, so I'm 5 minutes out.
Okay.
And there is a lady with some very serious disabilities that they reported on knowing. She seemed to me from the description, and anybody can get this online and hear it, has a pretty darn good life going, but needs a lot of help and support. Mm-hmm. And apparently SSI just denied some big thing. And they said something like, and it may have just been a reporter getting excited, a $300,000 chair that she needs to be able to And I'm thinking, man, you know.
It's an expensive chair. And I don't know details about that case. Anybody watch, what's John Oliver's show on HBO? Last Week Tonight on,
An episode about
on,
in society.
yep. So the ways in which, called the disability penalty, right? There are folks that, because whether or not you get SSDI benefits is a function of not just your income, your wealth, that there are married couples that whom merely the fact that they are married means that they're over the limit. And so great episode. If you haven't seen it yet, definitely watch. Rebecca Coakley, who's a national disability rights advocate that I know only through social media, was talking, was actually one of the experts that they talked to in putting that piece together. So there are lots of hard questions about what this looks like, but the way in which our current policies and laws seem to be problematic. But it's a lot easier to say this is problematic than to say what should replace it. And so, right, whether or not somebody who, right, needs a $300,000 chair should have access to it, and how that would come from, right? Because $300,000 would buy a lot of malaria nets. And malaria nets are super effective in preventing people from dying from malaria.
I'm glad
Hard call.
you showed us a tough case.
Yep. Yep.
Speaking of SSD and SSI, I want to hear your hot take on how that system is very, very, very broken. Like, do you think that do you feel that it's intentionally so, or just a massive amount of incompetence?
So here I have to say that anything that I say beyond this is outside my scholarly expertise, because I have done no scholarly.
I just want to hear you go off about it, that's all.
And there's only so much I know because our son is 16, right? And so we've only navigated through some of that world. In Idaho, in order to get any state benefits, turns out you have to apply for Social Security and be denied twice. And that's the first step into getting any sorts of programs. Okay.
I've been in the process for like 8 years. My current claim is 3 years old.
Okay. And then we moved to Michigan, different state, had to start the process over, so I had to apply for Social Security for him twice again. And then in Michigan, we run it differently, and so he was admitted to the waiver program. So there are like 3 buckets of state money that serve disabled folks, and one of them has a legit cap on the number of people that can be in it. So he was on the wait list for about 5 years. So we're either waiting for somebody to age out of the program and no longer get benefits, or somebody to no longer need them, but the folks that are in that program have disabilities that are probably not gonna go away, or people to die off and open up spots. Finally got into it. We have been waiting for the last, he got approved the week before COVID hit. And one of the things that he gets in this program is he's qualified for 30 hours of community living supports care a week. When was COVID? 2020? It's 4 years now, and we have not been able to find somebody to actually provide the services that he has, right? So the system is really, really messed up. I have had the thought when I came to Michigan that often it looks like it's set up in a way to make denial easier, in the same way that insurance is often set up to make insurance denial. So my experience, there was one day that I literally spent 5 hours on the phone trying to figure out which of these state programs our son would qualify under. And I ended up over about 3 of those 5 hours, like being transferred in a circle, all the way back to the original position. And because they were done by different groups in the state of Michigan in a way that they were done by one group in the state of Idaho, like it was structural incompetence. And I had the thought, it seems like you might, right? Like this was on purpose, in order to make it harder to access. And
You can never tell if it's just massive incompetence or if it's intentionally set up.
And it's probably a combination of both to varying degrees. So that's my hot take. But it is admittedly fairly only experientially informed and not scholarly informed.
Your experience mimics ours and those
Yep.
of everyone we've spoken to.
Yep. And again, when I start having an experience, I look around who's gone through similar sorts of things, and
I'm glad that you're working right now to get your son like declared disabled officially in the law and everything. So my mom never did that, and I've been paying for it.
yeah,
ever since,
it's
so.
one of the many emails in my inbox is to start thinking about things like guardianship. Guardianship super complicated because it's stages. Is that a hand back there? Okay, so I'm going to end with a question. This has already been a little bit long. I'm going to end with a question from the back.
So like, for the private Christian schools, what would be like the limit, like in the sense of the limit that they have to teach students about disabilities and like how they have to accept in that sense?
What is the limit of how much they have to?
Do they have to teach us about it?
Nope, not at all. Private Christian schools do not have to, private religious schools, not just Christian schools, do not have to teach. Public schools technically don't have to teach about disability. One of the things that's always interesting when students come, the first day I ask my student, one of the things I ask my students on the first day is, how many of you heard about the civil rights movement in the United States? Get lots of hands. How many of you have heard about the push for women's suffrage in the United States? Get lots of hands. Black History Month, Women's History Month, right? Hispanic History Month, and I get lots and lots of hands. How many of you heard about the disability civil rights movement? And they all go down. How many of you heard about Disability History Month? No hands. So private Christian schools don't have to do any, legally don't have to do any teaching about disability. You might think that they've got theological reasons that they should. And again, they don't have to try and incorporate a certain view of the value of folks because they're private and religious and they can, within certain constraints, basically do what they want. And boo on that. So, okay. Thank you.